You're muted, Trish.
It's okay. I was just talking to my cat. She was trying to get up in my grill. I said, "Excuse."
Would you like me to kick it off?
Guess so.
Okay, yep.
Heck.
All right, well, thank you everyone for being here and taking time to have this discussion. Thank you to Greg and Anya for joining us. I wanted to set the stage briefly for this discussion. I'm Scott Wright. I'm your president-elect on the Board of Trustees for the Ethical Society of St. Louis. And I wanted to just briefly talk a little bit about how we got here and why we're all in this room right now. So there's two key, I think, relevant goals that the Board of Trustees has for this year, one of which is to increase transparency between the board and our membership. And another one is to explore the Ethical Society of St. Louis's relationship with the American Ethical Union. So there's been a lot of big changes happening at the American Ethical Union, which is the large national body that we are a local affiliate of. There's been some leadership changes. There's been some structural changes on the board. And we've just been interested in holding discussions and exploring how the Ethical Society of St. Louis continues to move forward in that relationship with the American Ethical Union. So in pursuit of that goal, we've had several communications already about from the AEU to membership. In our connections and our weekly email blast, we have held a, what would you call it, a town hall meeting several Sundays ago. And this is another effort in that same vein to get everyone together to hold a discussion. And we have the honor this time of having Greg Bonin and Anya Overman as well to help contribute to these discussions. So I'll read some brief introductions of who those are for your context. Greg Bonin is an ethical culture leader. He is the AEU's Director of Administration and Organizational Culture and a candidate for ministerial fellowship with the Unitarian Universalist Association. Greg specializes in institutional and organizational facilitation, bringing a praxis grounded in embodiment, humanistic interdependence, and reflective inquiry as a method for lifelong formation. Greg is especially curious about queering practices that create spaces where transformative paradigms can emerge. Anya Overman is a lifelong member of the ethical culture. Anya has been a member of the Ethical Society of St. Louis since kindergarten. She has gone on to represent the future of ethical societies at assemblies hosted by the International Humanists and Young Humanist International. Anya has served as the president of Young Humanist International and as a director on Humanist International's board from 2020 to 2022. Since 2020, she's been a digital nomad, working as a writer while traveling the world. Anya also hosts a podcast called The Nomadic Humanist, and I will just add on there that she is both a member of the Ethical Society of St. Louis and our representative on the board to the American Ethical Union and the current secretary on the board of the American Ethical Union. Before I pass it off to Greg and Anya to amend those descriptions in any way they like and give some opening remarks, I wanted to go over some community agreements and set the stage for how we'd like to hold this dialogue. I actually have a link to our community agreements in my chat ready to go, if I could find the chat. There it is. I'm not going to read all of our community agreements, but that is a link to our website with our full list of community agreements. And I just wanted to highlight a few of them. So as we're having this conversation, consider and apply the most charitable interpretation when intentions are ambiguous or unclear. Listen with respect and curiosity to other members of the conversation. Speak for yourself and from your own experience, and avoid the use of judgmental or inflammatory language. If there are any disagreements, criticize issues, not people, and strive to disagree respectfully. Finally, a little piece of Zoom etiquette. We are recording this meeting, so any members that are not in attendance may view it later. Anyone who chooses to be on camera or speak up and ask a question will do so with the implicit consent to be recorded. Please mute yourself if you are not speaking. This reduces audio echoes and background noises. There are multiple co-hosts on this on the Zoom, and we will mute you if we need to. So please don't be offended. It is to reduce background noise. Also, please be mindful to make any questions you have specific and succinct so that we may include as many questions as possible in our limited meeting time. With that all out of the way, I'd like to pass it over to Greg and Anya to give any opening remarks and provide any additional context that they'd like to bring to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. It's good to see everyone. And as Scott mentioned, my name is Greg Bonin. I'm the Director of Administration and Organizational Culture for the American Ethical Union. I'm an ethical culture leader. I'm also Vice President for the National Leaders Council, which is the group for clergy within the movement. I want to just say that I'm here in addition to maybe answer some questions to learn about you, to learn about St. Louis. I had a really great conversation with Scott and Rachel from your board earlier, and I am very appreciative for that. And so I just want to kind of frame two things. One, just asking the question, what is the AEU? I know y'all got a fact sheet and you also had my write-up. But at its most basic, the AEU is an organizing group that facilitates the national ethical culture movement. That's a really simple, easy way to think about what the AEU is. Institutionally, we do have a board of directors. We have volunteer working committees and groups, and we also have the National Leaders Council, as I mentioned. We serve and are constituted by our member societies and circles, like the Ethical Society of St. Louis. We also certify ethical culture leaders who serve as clergy for our movement. We certify officiants who can conduct ceremonies that are legally recognized. And guided by our working committees and the board of directors, we coordinate national services that include things like trainings, ethical action and education, and quarterly and annual movement-wide gatherings. All of what I just described is really kind of operational and transactional. I'll say that I came to the AEU because it connects me with a community that's larger than myself. And I think that this is an essential part of the American Ethical Union. I do believe ethical culture has a unique identity with an orienting worldview that can help our communities and our world make sense and meaning from their lives. I think that's hugely important. And I'll just say that your former leaders, Kate Lovelady and James Croft, were both mentors for me. And so they have deeply impressed some of this upon me. So I'm very grateful to them. And then I also want to share another piece that's a little more specific because I think it's helpful as one framing for our conversation tonight. And this is some information, I'm going to maybe be a little repetitive, but this was in the fact sheet in the one-pager that was sent out. But in July 2023, the AEU had its National Assembly, and there was an amendment that was adopted to change the AEU board from a board of 11 elected directors to a board of 25 representative directors. I mean, that's a pretty key change. Two pieces there. One, that the board went from 11 people to 25 people, and then two, that it went from being an elected board of directors to a representative board of directors. And that's a pretty different structure and way of showing up. The current officers were actually elected at that same assembly and started their term in October. So that's Condra Sears, who's the president, Jay Hooper, who's the vice president, Anya Oberman, who's the secretary, and then Liz Singer, who's the treasurer. I was also hired in October of 2023. So just to kind of give us a little sense of time. As I was reading through the St. Louis newsletters and the community conversations, what I noticed was that there's been at least 3 different boards and lead staff that were referenced in those conversations and the newsletters. And so just a reminder that the AEU is not some eternal monolithic entity. It's actually made of people. It's not Soylent Green, but it is made of people. I hope I didn't give a spoiler away there for anybody who hasn't read that. But when we talk about the AEU board, we're actually talking about different groups of officers and directors over time. And at the core, the AEU is constituted by its member societies. And I think that's true now more than ever. So it's less about, from my perspective, whether or not I succeed or the AEU succeeds as an institution. And it's more about whether we can flourish together. That I think is a really key goal, particularly when we're looking at the national movement. I think I'll close there. I had some other pieces to say, but I think we'll get into some of that as we move into some questions and answers. So I'll hand it off to Anya, I think is next.
Thanks, Greg. Thank you, Scott, for that introduction. It was pretty thorough. I just want to add two pieces to that. The first being that the real motivation that I had to join the AEU board was really St. Louis. I have felt for a long time that the Ethical Society of St. Louis has been really key to forming who I am as an adult today. And frankly, after James Croft's platform that was very memorable in 2022, I believe it was in May 2022, where he discussed the decline of the ethical culture movement, I felt really driven to throw my hat in the ring. And the main reason for that was really because of how St. Louis impacted me. So I just want to leave that piece as we kind of move into these conversations. And the second piece I wanted to add is, in addition to serving as secretary of the board and as your representative, I'm also serving as assembly co-chair. And I just want to take a moment to plug that. We are holding the assembly in Minneapolis, Minnesota on July 26th to the 28th this year. It will be held at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, with which we have a pretty great relationship. They are offering their building free of charge, which is an enormous cost savings to us. And we have a very deep historic connection with the First Unitarian Society and with Minneapolis and in general, with our ethical culture roots. There are connections there. So that's very exciting. And that will be actually dove into and presented in a more exciting way during the platform at Assembly this year. And I also want to just let you all know that this will be going out in the next week. However, we've released to the presidents and to board members as of yesterday that we are now accepting nominations for both the Elliott Black Award and the Anna Garland Spencer Award. And we are also accepting submissions for programming for the assembly. So just wanted to put that out there. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to email me. And that's all I want to say. I'll hand it over to Scott or whoever's taking over next.
Yeah, I can take it back. So we did solicit questions ahead of time through a Google form, which we received a few responses. One of those initial questions I had sent to you ahead of time, Greg and Anya, I think we can go ahead and start addressing some of those now. And then you indicated an intent earlier to maybe make this a little more open as a dialogue sort of thing, if possible. So we'll take it from there. Do you have that question on hand?
I do.
Do you mind reading it out loud? I don't.
Oh,
I have too many tabs pulled up.
got it. Yes. Okay. Thank you. So I have two questions that I received. One is leader training, and is ethical culture leader training funded by contributions from society apportionments? And the short answer there is yes. And so I want to maybe break that down a little bit because I'm guessing there's a little bit more to that question than just a simple yes or no. And just to say that, so leader training, if you don't know, the AEU has a leadership committee, and that's comprised of both lay leaders from throughout the movement, plus ethical culture leaders, certified ethical culture leaders. There's also a kind of sub or secondary committee, which is called the Leadership Training Committee. And that committee is responsible for working directly one-on-one with the ethical culture leader folks that are completing the curriculum. So like right now, Louise, not to single you out, but Louise is completing that curriculum. And so the Leadership Training Committee would work closely with Louise to ensure that all of the requirements are met. And then the fuller review goes before the leadership committee, again, which has both lay leaders and ethical culture leaders. And I want to name that because I think that's hugely important, that we have representation of both lay leaders and ethical culture leaders. I think that's a really important dynamic. The other thing that I'll mention is the apportionments piece. So if you all don't know, and I'm guessing most of the folks, at least whose faces I can see, know that apportionment is a member dues that's paid to the American Ethical Union. And apportionment on the society level is framed according to how that society works. And all I mean by that is to say that, like, for instance, if 50% of a society's budget comes from apportionment, then your contribution to the society might be a little bit of a different percentage than another society who has a larger or smaller percentage of their budget coming from member contributions, pledges, et cetera. So, and so that's why you might see some different figures. Like one society will say, well, the first $75 goes to apportionment. Another one will say the first $133 goes to apportionment. So that's just a small piece. But the apportionment then goes to the AEU according to a formula that was created, and then I think it was revised maybe a couple of years ago. But there is a plan to revise the formula for the coming year, so that'll be different. And more recently, and this was on the one-pager, apportionment was reduced by 10% for the current year. So I think St. Louis was paying about 10,000 a quarter, and it's down to about 9,000. Very rough numbers; they're not exact numbers, so please don't quote me on that. But but essentially that reduces your apportionment, and the broader theme there is really trying to reduce AEU reliance on apportionment, which is going to take time. I mean, it takes time to change any kind of any portfolio. So the other thing that's important to note is that the New York Society for Ethical Culture has an Adler Fund. So Felix Adler, who's the founder of the movement, there is a fund named after him, and they manage that portfolio and also how those funds are dispersed. There's criteria around it. The kind of succinct description is that that fund is really meant to be used for leadership training more broadly. And so yes, leader training is funded by apportionments, by member society apportionments. It is also funded in large part from the Adler Fund. So for instance, like Luis did an internship, I did an internship. That internship was funded in part by the Adler Fund specifically. So it's a mix of sources that it's funded by. So I want to maybe toss it back to y'all and say, are there stemming questions there? Because this could easily unfold into a big long diatribe, and I don't want that. I'm more interested in delivering the kind of information that would be useful for you and your members.
I'm Alan Easton. I'm the person who posed that question. I just wondered if the Adler Fund covered all of the costs of leader training, because it looks like, from looking at old budgets, that was the case.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I posed the question.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. It's a mix, but a lot of it does come from the Adler Fund. And one thing that I'll say, and it's no secret, I think it's actually been talked about in the community conversations, is that we've had fewer and fewer applicants to the program, and we've had fewer and fewer ethical culture leaders being certified through the program. And there's lots of reasons for that, right? National trends, our own institution, our own curriculum. There's lots of reasons for that. But what I want to point to on that is to say, there are traditions, there are histories, and we're moving toward, I think the world is, but I think institutions that are going to survive kind of this turn are going to become more agile and responsive. So that means, again, not only diversifying our funds, but looking at how to do leader training differently. And some of that has to do with where our funding comes from and where it goes to. So I'll just kind of bookmark that one of the things that we're looking to do is revitalize the lay leadership training program. And part of the Adler funds for this year are actually going toward that. as opposed to being, almost wholly dedicated to any one leader certification.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Is there anything else on that? Because if not, oh, go ahead, Trish.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear that the lay leadership, there's funds for it. What are the plans? Like what's actually going to be taking place?
Right now, there is a proposal, and that's about it. A little bit later, like in the next week or so, you should actually see an invitation to a workshop that is kind of a pilot, just to start testing the waters. There have been a couple of iterations of lay leadership training throughout AEU's history. Most recently, we had the Lay Leadership Summer School. I think the last cohort might have been 2017 or 2018, but I think it's 2017. And subsequent to that, there was some development of curriculum, but I don't know that curriculum was ever delivered. So, and I'll use this as an opportunity to say, and Trish, I'm going to dig behind your question there a little bit to say that, so many of our initiatives, so many people have put a lot of work into the AEU, into creating structures that then disappear or are dropped, and there's lots of reasons for that. And so what I hear in your question, Trish, is for me a core question: what are we going to do differently this time? And I think that's key because I don't believe that we can keep asking people to do work, to transfer resources, if we're not going to do something different than what we've done in the past. So for the lay leadership piece specifically, again, initial thinking, we're going to do some pilots, it's going to come out in phases, but there's kind of 3 tracks we're thinking about right now. One of them being hard skills, like administration, like budgeting, things like that. There's going to be soft skills, and that's really the core of kind of leadership development, to say, what does it mean to be a lay leader in our movement? And that has to do with things, learning about self-differentiated leadership. It has to do with what does it mean to hold a space that's accessible to as many people as possible. What are the ways that we can facilitate our meetings and our groups? And then also the last piece, and I think this is really critical, is kind of a track on ethical culture identity. And that piece, and there's some correspondence here between leader training and lay leadership training, to say that there might be some overlap. Now, I want to be very clear, I am not the decision maker here. So I can architect some things, I can propose, I can facilitate, but at the end of the day, the board is the one that really needs to be making decisions about how to spend, how to implement. So, as I mentioned, this is a new iteration of the board in many ways, not only new officers and new board members, but it's a brand new way of coming together, going from 11 people to 25 people, and then saying, how are we going to do this work, right? So I just wanted to dig behind your question there a little bit, because, again, coming back to that key question of what are we going to do differently this time, I think is really important to ask as we move into kind of every new thing. Does that address your question, Trish?
Yeah, it sounds like there isn't a specific plan, but there's a plan to plan for lay leadership training.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. So I'll just say briefly about the phasing piece. So kind of phase 1, at least in the proposal, is to start delivering workshops nationally. And so we're going to look at, for instance, there will be an enrollment call for enrollment for a organizational immunity to change, which is like a Harvard taught course that ethical culture leader Joan Lewis has facilitated in the past. And she's doing that as a collaboration with Wes, and then making it open as a virtual, an online workshop in a 4-part series, right? And so that's one thing. And this is the differently part, I think. And I don't speak with any authority of what came before, but to implement things like feedback loops and evaluations, so we can do some course correction, so we can make sure that it's accessible, so that we can build some mechanisms for mutual support and mutual accountability, so that at the end of the day, when we do come to the place where we can say, oh, look, we have a full lay leadership curriculum, it's going to take time. It's going to take hopefully input from a lot of people. And, balancing that kind of visioning work with outcomes in production, because it can't be only one or the other. Yeah. Scott, I don't know if you want to call people. I see Bob's got his hand up.
Yeah, I think that'll work well. If we're satisfied with that conversation, yeah, Bob, you want to go ahead and give your question?
Yes. So we heard a while back about there were 3 proposals, or how the AEU might move forward. And my understanding, I mean, I apologize if I missed what happened there, but my understanding is maybe none of those were formally adopted. And so maybe take a step back and answer this question. Is the AEU fully functional right now in terms of the interactions that we're used to, in terms of training leaders and doing everything that the AEU has always done, or are some of those services shut down right now?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Bob. That's actually a really excellent question. I'll take a half step back, as you asked, and just say kind of what I referenced earlier in the assembly. So at the assembly, what was being called scenario resolutions for the future of the American Ethical Union were proposed. And there were multiple ways of proposing them. Once they got to the assembly, they were voted on using a ranked choice voting. And so at the end of the day, there were 2 really kind of more popular proposals. And one called for a reassessment, another called for, I think the phrase they were using to characterize it was social innovation. And so after the voting stopped, even though one resolution had gotten slightly more votes than the other, neither resolution received enough votes to actually be implemented by the American Ethical Union. So it didn't pass the minimum vote requirement. So that's what got us here now. And in the meantime, and that's actually where the switch from the board came from. So it was actually announced at the assembly that one of those scenarios won. And so subsequent votes were made, maybe, I don't want to presume here, but subsequent votes were made on the basis that this scenario had won. And the amendment changing the composition of the board from elected to representative was attached to the one that was declared the winner. Fast forward a day or 2, and they actually rescinded that announcement because they realized that actually no scenario had received enough votes to be passed at the assembly business meeting. So what we were left with was no clear path to move forward, no description, no structure. Also with a mandate, legal mandate, because it was our bylaws, to change our board from elected to representative board members. And so there was really no clear guidance for how to make that transition. There was, I don't want to call it a burden, but the work of that landed on societies very differently. And so, for instance, societies that had not had board members previously were now tasked with having a representative at the board level. And I'll say, being on the AEU board is a lot of work. And so for, going from nothing to that, and then in some situations, The bylaw reads that if there is no representative available, that task falls to the president of the society. Well, presidents are running their societies, right? Then to add that whole other additional responsibility on. So we currently have two societies that actually don't have representatives at the board level because they just don't have the capacity for it. And I described that because I think it's a really good example to respond to your question about whether we're fully functional. Because so much has changed in a very short time. In addition to, and this might be some of the elephant in the room, the last year has been really, really challenging. I know it's been challenging for individual societies. It's also been challenging at the national level because there's been a lot of tension that played out through, for instance, the assembly, and a lot of tension that played out through the board, the different board iterations. And so I think the answer that the immediate answer you might be looking for is continues in that we were tasked with changing the board composition. There was no guiding scenario, and we had a new slate of officers, historic election, youngest, most diverse slate of officers that we've had, and I think the board too at large. And then, and so one of the decisions that was made was to pause the committees because part of the tension had been at the committee level. And frankly, I want to introduce the word burnout because that is a lot of what I have heard about and been in dialogue with people about, where we showed up, October started, that's the start of our fiscal year, and many of the chairs had either resigned or had come to term limits. And so here we were looking for people to do work and it wasn't there. And so taking a cue from one of the scenarios, saying, okay, so let's reevaluate this. Let's look at bringing our working committees more into alignment with the broader mission of the AEU to serve what our societies and what our movement needs. And that's where we are right now. I know timelines, as again, like there's a qualitative piece, but then there's also the actual deliverables. And so we're currently working to reopen our committees. The Finance Committee actually never was paused. That has always been going. So I want to make that distinction because you might hear that. But the timeline for that is to reopen the committees by the next board meeting, the Q3 board meeting, which is in April. So so again, a piece of the fully functional is in that. We've also taken a cue from the other scenario and said, okay, so how can we, as a national institution, more materially serve our member societies? And in that came the new budget. Right, there was a draft budget proposed in October. The board also switched from meeting monthly from 3 to 6 hours, I think, on a Saturday, to meeting quarterly for 2 hours, for 90 minutes to 2 hours, I think it is. And all, again, having that impact on the functional piece. But in that transition, being able to then say, okay, so we're going to reopen our committees. We're going to task those committees with evaluating how they can be in better alignment with the board. And I want to be clear, like we have some very passionate, very generous volunteers who give of their time, who are dedicated, who believe fiercely in the purpose of the AEU and the work that we do. And this is not a commentary on that. This is just to say that we are moving toward reconstituting our committees to accomplish the work that we're tasked with. So the other piece that you asked about is training leaders. Right now, Louise Jett, as you might know, is the only person that is currently awaiting certification. And my understanding and hope is that Louise will be certified soon. And we're working on that. We're just kind of going through the checklist. And in the meantime, I actually met this morning with two former members of the leadership committee to talk about, so how do we get this up and going again? Like, how do we keep what was working and what was worthwhile? How do we reevaluate so that we can move forward and continue our operations, continue responding to people who have asked about leader training? How do we I want to avoid the word proselytize, but how do we actually offer to the public and let the public know what ethical culture is, what our identity means in informing the way that we move through the world, and how our lay leaders and our ethical culture leaders steward that throughout the movement. So I have used this question as an opportunity to expand things, but I just want to say that many of these questions are not a simple yes or no. And one of the things that I'll just add on that and close with is that part of what we're called to do right now, I'm borrowing from Brian Stevenson, who's from the Equal Justice Initiative. He talks about 4 things. He says, we need to stay proximate. We need to change the narrative. We need to not lose hope. And I think this last piece is hugely important right now. We need to do things that are uncomfortable and inconvenient. It's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of passion. It's going to take a lot of coming to the table to maybe heal some of the things that have been hurt, because there is a lot of hurt in the movement. And that has a significant impact on the functionality piece that you're asking about. Because we need to restore those relationships in order to work together, and that can't be our only work. So I want to be clear about that. So I kind of wandered and meandered with your question. I hope that was okay, but did I address the core of your question?
Yes. Yeah, I have more questions, but I don't want to dominate that whole discussion, but thank you.
Well, I did post in the chat that anyone can feel free to use the raise hand function if you have any questions you'd like to ask. Greg, did you want to address the second question that was submitted in any way?
Sure, yeah. Okay, so thank you, Scott. That's a good prompt. So the other question that was passed on, and I will say and I hope this is not a slight. For me, it's phrased a little awkwardly because it's specific to St. Louis, and I'm obviously not at St. Louis. So, but I'll read the question as it was submitted, which is, throughout the past 3 decades, and after they dismissed Dr. John Hode and took down the sign that read "a liberal religious institution," why do you think might the St. Louis Society's various leaders have chosen to limit the discussion and sharing of AEU positions, newsletters, and various shares, other than leaving a few copies on Bud Darup's, and I apologize if I have mispronounced that name, literature table time to time? Is that a named table at the Society? Is that like an in memoriam, or no? Okay.
It's an active member who was really interested in ethical action, and he would put out a lot of material for people.
Yeah, I love these little glimpses into local culture. I think it's really wonderful. The reason I actually like this question is because I think it comes to the heart of what I was noticing in the transcript of the community conversations and some of the newsletters, which is that there's a lot of story. There's a lot of story about what the AEU is or is not. There's a lot of story about people, particularly people who are no longer accessible to us, like your former board representative, I think from 2 boards ago. The leaders that I mentioned, Kate Lovelady and James Croft. It is no secret that they are no longer, the leaders are no longer part of ethical culture. So, and why that's significant to me is because I know how deeply embedded Kate and James were in the AEU and ethical culture. And just in conversations I've had with them, I know how important they believe the AEU to be. And I do not want to speak for them. I'm only speaking for my experience of the conversations that I have had for them. And please hear it as that, not as me trying to use their names to validate anything. But what I noticed in the conversations is it didn't seem to be a whole lot of definitive from the AEU or from those people responses to some of the questions that have been offered. And it was a lot of like, well, I think this happened, or I think that happened, or why did that person leave, or why did the AEU do this? And so so what I'm reading in this question is somebody, I'm assuming maybe a member of St. Louis, observing that there is an absence of AEU presence at St. Louis. And that's a curiosity that I have, is to say, so St. Louis, as you've noted in these conversations, has been transferring a lot of resources, that's the phrase I will use, and giving a lot of money to the AEU. And I'm curious, like, where have you been? Like this is an opportunity, and I ask that really just glibly, like facetiously, because particularly in the switch to a representative board, it's such a wonderful opportunity for you as a society to shape the future of the movement. And I will say that I know, like I came up in the Asheville Society. Asheville is tiny. They don't employ an ethical culture leader. It's completely lay-led, and they rent once a week from a Quaker meeting house, right? Which is a very different culture than what St. Louis has. And so, but you're both at the table saying, what is this movement of ours? How can the board shape the way we move forward together? And I quote one of my colleagues here because I think it's just hugely important. All of us need all of us to make it, and I really do believe that. I believe we need St. Louis. I believe that St. Louis, I'm going to use the word needs the American Ethical Union more, again, as the institution that facilitates the national movement than the institution itself. I think that's a really important distinction. I'll kind of close there because that can keep going, and I see another hand raised in Zoom. Scott, do you want to?
Yeah, well, Bob, do you have a comment on that or a separate question?
So my comment is related to this. I feel that, and I wanted to really address my question to Anya if she thinks it's appropriate. But we've heard from St. Louis. Here we are. We're distant from the East Coast and from the AEU. We've heard that there have been some bad things that have happened. And our leaders, Kate and James both resigned from the leadership council. I'm not sure what the name of that organization is, but they both stepped down because of this thing that happened, alleged unethical behavior. At this point, a lot of us know something about this incident or an incident. I don't know if there are multiple things, but it seems like for us here in St. Louis, maybe the first step to reconnecting St. Louis to the AEU is let's have some transparency. Why can't we talk openly? It doesn't even have to be names, but a lot of our members don't even know what that incident was or other incidents. I mean, I don't know all of the troubles that have happened internally with AEU. And in some way, I think I would like that to be more open.
Yeah, I think there's a question in there, and I think the question that I'm hearing is why has there been such a lack of transparency around what seems to be pretty concerning things happening at the national level? And I agree, and I had the same question when I came onto this board in 2022. And through my work with this board, I learned a lot about what had happened, and part of the reason why it's so hard to be transparent around this specific issue is because there are legal things that are preventing people from talking about it, and quite frankly, a lot of fear around crossing a line inadvertently. I mean, I had that fear myself. But what I can say is I think there are other things that we can talk about, that it's not just been a single thing that has defined this really turbulent time in the AEU. It's been a series of things. And I think you're right. I think, St. Louis absolutely, and the rest of the society is absolutely deserve more transparency around that, because these tensions really can't be improved upon until these are discussed and out in the open. So what I will say about that is that yes, I can say personally that I've experienced a lot of challenges being on this board. There's been a lot of relational breakdown, which has made just completing the operational side of the work really challenging. And then we've had things happen like Elle Miller, who was a really core staff person at the AEU, passed away, and that was a huge loss for us. A huge loss in knowledge and the inner workings of our organization. We've had people retire. We've had people step down. So like Greg was kind of saying earlier, there's been a lot of changes in a very, very truncated period of time. So I don't really know where I'm going with this other than to say I agree with you. And I myself have tried to be open about some of the things that I've noticed on this board and some of the things that are really creating obstacles in our relational work with one another as board members. A lot of those things have been not as well received as I had hoped. And those things include stuff like white supremacy and frankly, I'd go so far as to say bullying. There's been behavior that is really hard to work around, especially when you are working with a lot of already burnt out volunteers. So that's kind of the really short version of a lot of the challenges that I've experienced personally working on this board. And frankly, my recommendation for St. Louis moving forward is to really think about, okay, how can we really put forward what we want out of this movement? Because St. Louis is powerful and frankly supports a lot of other societies that might not exist without that support. So and I just want to call back again to the reason that I joined the sport in the first place, is that I really felt called, if we want to use that word. I know that that's a word that is kind of used in a religious sense a lot of the time, but I felt compelled to really put some effort in to save this national movement and keep it moving forward, because I think Allison Heil said it in this last meeting that when she likes to network with visitors to the society, one of the high points that she likes to use is that we're part of a national movement, and that is the same thing that I feel is this greater connection to a movement that you can refer to outside of St. Louis. So I know that went a little off course. I hope that kind of addressed some of the things that you were bringing up, Bob.
Well, Anya, that was the question, which is why can't you? And I think that I realize that there is a legal aspect to it, and I understand that. But in any case, I do think at some point, if some clearing of the air could happen, that might be a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
Trish, did you have a take you still want to share from chat?
Yeah, it's kind of more like pragmatic. The question about the Bud DeRapp's table, because he was a really active member in our society. He was an older member even back then. And he was the paper generation. So he was really interested in like collecting all these resources and flyers and newsletters and displaying them. And times have changed. Information is now disseminated from the AEU to members directly rather than to the societies to put out on tables for the members to pick up. And so I think that a lot of it has to do with times changing, and people can either seek out the information or the information is just disseminated in a different way.
And I actually really want to thank you for that, Trish. That is a wonderful observation. And I love that because that, I'm Gen X, right? I grew up analog, I aged into digital. And so it's really interesting for me to hear that kind of transition because I think that's a really important dynamic to pay attention to. Because how we're connected, when I think about the notion of durability, like paper in a way is durable in a way that digital content is not, right? And so when I think about putting bodies in shared space together, like coming into the building at St. Louis and having a piece of paper there versus something that flashes through on our phone, which, our digital information is ephemeral and very, very focus limited, right? So that I think is an important dynamic. And I also want to just key in briefly on something that you said about collecting resources. When I talk about phasing and programs, that first phase is to start developing institutional resources or refining the resources that exist. Because I think that is a big part of what we can make available to member societies as a way to say, here is something so that you don't need to do this alone or that you don't need to do this in isolation, whether that is a curriculum, whether that is like a national gathering, but really making sure that we're doing our due diligence in, for instance, succession. Like Anya mentioned, we had a lot of rapid succession, but what does it mean then to deal with it? And I will say, when I go into my Google Drive, I am looking at least 3 prior executive directors' drives and how they all organize that with everybody's unique notation about like, oh, well, I don't know if I backed up this folder yet, so I'm going to back it up here and just name it 2, right? And so how do we then make sense of that in a way that we can deliver it so that it's accessible and digestible to our members rather than just saying, here's a big old thing with randomly named files, right? Here's a table of paper. And I'm not knocking tables of paper because I like tables of paper, but anyway, I'll stop there. Scott?
Yeah, I just wanted to call out that we're in the final 8 minutes here of our scheduled time together. So if anyone has some last minute lightning round style questions for some quick questions and quick responses, now's the time. Trish?
Yeah, I don't know how lightning round this one is, but you mentioned, Greg, that St. Louis's support of the AEU helps support other societies. And I know that that is a recurring concern for our members, that we are supporting other societies. I wonder if you can explain to us the ways that the AEU does support those smaller societies.
Yeah, that's a great question, Trish. And rather than treating the question as lightning round, I'll try to answer it in lightning round, which is that one of the things that I've been spending a lot of time on is consulting with societies, societies of different sizes, and your apportionment pays my salary so that I can work with the societies to deliver resources, to do facilitation, to connect societies so they can do shared work. It also looks like developing those resources so I can deliver them to societies. It might look like, for instance, in the budget that was passed in January, there are lines for society microgrants. There's a line for society capacity training, which is hopefully partly going to be the lay leadership training, but also partly maybe being able to hire a consultant to work with societies who are lay led or who do not have a professional leader. Both capital L and I know Amy is a director of, I think, of the ministerial team. So really making sure that we are able to provide something not only to specific societies, but again, providing a national service is supporting the smaller societies. Having a quarterly 5th Sunday All Society platform is supporting our smaller societies in addition to our larger societies, putting together a lay leadership training program, for small societies who can't afford that, and pairing them with larger societies. That's kind of the sibling societies program. So I promised I would try and keep that short. So I'll pause it there. If you have a specific aspect you want to ask about, happy to respond to that.
Bob?
So this is also not lightning, but I'll talk fast if I can. Greg, you have experience both with the AEU and with the UUA, and we have at least one society that's affiliated with both. We have two big societies that both have UUA trained leaders, and I wondered, I was a little discouraged by what David Breeden had to say during one of those sessions with him, that he's not happy, it sounds like, with what the UUA does, but as a group, is it something we should look at? Should we look at affiliating to this larger thing, or should we stay separate?
I can't answer that question for you. That is a question of discernment that needs to happen at your society's level. What I can do is be part of the conversation to tell you what my experience is. And I can tell you why, for instance, I am both an ethical culture leader and a candidate for ministry. Like that, I actually went into seminary as an ethical culture leader. I didn't learn about Unitarian Universalism until I started taking classes, because it was a UU seminary. And the reason I chose that seminary was because they were creating a new program in partnership with the American Humanist Association, which was going to become the new Humanist Institute. That kind of didn't happen, but I was able to take the first three courses, which were, frankly, the Humanism 2 was like by far the best class that I took in my seminary experience. And I want to name that
Greg,
because
let me stop you real quick. So I wasn't saying should ethical St. Louis, should the society in St. Louis look at doing this. I'm talking about the entire AEU looking at doing this together, not one society at a time. I don't like that
yeah.
Piecemeal approach. So
Yeah, thank you.
I'm saying, should we the whole thing?
Yeah. Thank you for that distinction. I misunderstood the question. I don't have a short answer to that. I will say that the UUA is a much larger movement than we are. Their structures are much more robust and resilient, and they have, frankly, the resources to keep up with the changes that are happening, particularly over the last 5 years. So I think we can benefit from them because there's a lot of shared culture there. Whether we affiliate, I would be more interested at first exploring a partnership to see how we might benefit from resources, we might benefit from professional partnerships. Because you're absolutely right. What you've observed is right. We have several ethical culture leaders who are duly affiliated. We have Wes, who is duly affiliated. And that's there for a reason. I chose UU because I chose to affiliate with UU because their resources were really excellent. And it was a challenge for me to translate some of Unitarian Universalism into my ethical culture identity. And I'm naming my experience because I think that speaks to the experience nationally, to say, I think it's vital that we not only preserve, but develop and put out what our unique ethical culture identity is, because I do feel that that unique identity has something really valuable to offer. So whether we call it an affiliation, a collaboration, a partnership, I do think there's benefit there. I want to name that, like, there is some very strong anti-UU sentiment within our movement, and I think that is something that we would want to address. I have more to say on that. We are 1 minute out from time, and I see Trish has her hand up. So,
Trish, please.
Yeah, I wanted to say that David was at the assembly this summer, and he actually recommended against going into the UU, the UU Humanist path, because he felt, I don't have a take, but he felt from an inside perspective that there wasn't support of the humanist perspective within UU. If anybody else remembers that statement differently, please correct me.
I will actually tag on there because I want to distinguish UU humanists from the UUA. They're two different things. And if there were to be an affiliation, I agree with David that it is not to be with the UU Humanist Association, because I don't think they actually have the kind of resources and support that we would want or need for our movement. I do think the UUA might. I do think that, and correspondingly, they have the UUMA, which is similar to our NLC. So those are, just to say that when we talk about UU, I think it's important to distinguish, just like when we talk about the AEU, there's the President's Council, there's the board, there's the NLC. Similarly, there's the UUA, the UUMA, and then there's the individual kind of identity. Like there's a religious naturalist group. And that is what David is speaking to, is that UU Humanist Association. And I did notice that in the community dialogues, and that was a little puzzling to me. I'll name that, because I actually do find not only strong support for humanism broadly within Unitarian Universalism, but it's kind of one of the founding principles of Unitarian Universalism is a very humanistic take. It's being pluralistic, not creedal, expecting people to do their own formative work about what they believe about the world, their morals, their ethics, without telling them what to believe.
Well, that's 8:01. That's 8 o'clock. I don't want to cut off good conversations, but I do want to be respectful of everybody's time here, and we committed to 1 hour. So I think we'll wrap it up there. This is being recorded. I believe Trish will get the recording on your account, and we'll upload that to our YouTube channel. Greg and Anya, do you want to maybe share your emails or something in the chat, or if you're open to further questions, if anyone has additional dialogue they'd like to share, any closing remarks you might have?
I do. I'm going to invite Anya to go first because I want to copy a link that I can put in chat.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad that these conversations are happening. I think they're a little long overdue, and I really hope that as a result, this ends up bringing St. Louis in closer relationship with the AEU, and really find a path forward that makes sense for St. Louis. So that's all I'll say on that, and pass to Greg.
Yeah, thank you. So I did put in the chat a link where you can access my calendar to book an appointment. I'm more than happy to talk one-on-one with folks. If you want to set up a small group meeting, happy to meet with you. I will also say that kind of thematically, St. Louis knows what St. Louis needs. And I want to be here as a resource to you to add to the conversation. I'd love to be part of the conversation. But anything that you might need from me as a society, like let's figure that out. But I just want to say deep appreciation. Even in the brief interactions I've had with people, it's clear to me that you care deeply about the community, you care deeply about the movement and how you participate in the movement. And I really appreciate the gift of your time today, the gift of your presence and questions. I love inquiry. So you're always welcome to toss some questions my way, and I'll do my best to respond to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Greg and Anya, for giving us your time and your service. We'll end it there.